The call came late at night. A Republican senator's phone lit up with the president's number, and what followed wasn't negotiation. It was profanity, threats, and rage, because for the first time Donald Trump's own party just told him no. This isn't opposition from Democrats. This isn't media spin. This is Republicans, his own people, quietly moving to block the power he's trying to seize. And when that happened, when lawmakers stepped in to draw a constitutional line, Trump didn't back down. He escalated. Right now, emergency declarations are being weaponized. War-level rhetoric is flying, and behind closed doors, panic is spreading because what's unfolding isn't just another political fight. It's a test of whether American power is ruled by law or by one man's instincts. Stay with me, because what happens next could reshape how presidents wield authority long after these headlines fade. Imagine this. Phones lighting up across Capitol Hill, aides whispering in hallways, senators checking their screens twice to make sure what they're reading is real, because the president is furious, not at his usual targets, but at his own party. And the rebellion isn't coming from protesters outside, it's coming from inside the walls. Republicans are revolting against Donald Trump, not the performative kind meant to impress donors. This is something deeper, colder, and far more dangerous, because it cuts into the one thing Trump believes he cannot survive without: unchecked power. The reason this revolt matters isn't just broken promises, not the vow of no new wars, not the soaring cost of living, not the long-promised disclosures that never seem to arrive. It's that Republican lawmakers themselves are openly moving against the very authority Trump is desperate to hold. And when guardrails inside the system start to activate, presidents don't respond calmly. They escalate, they dramatize, they declare emergencies. That's exactly what we're watching right now. At the heart of this revolt is a simple but terrifying reality even seasoned Washington veterans struggle to process out loud. The president has been publicly entertaining the idea of using military force in ways that could drag America into conflict, not with some distant adversary, but with its own allies. When Senator Chris Murphy laid this out in blunt terms, it landed like a shockwave. Because once you strip away the bluster, what you're left with is a scenario that sounds absurd, until you remember we've stopped being allowed to dismiss these statements as jokes. Greenland is not empty real estate. It is part of Denmark. Denmark is a NATO ally, and NATO's core principle is collective defense. Any military action against that territory isn't symbolic. It's a legal and strategic nightmare that theoretically places the United States in direct conflict with Europe. The fact that lawmakers are now having to seriously explain this to the public is itself a sign of how unmoored the conversation has become, because no one in America voted for a presidency that risks a shooting war with allies over land acquisition rhetoric. Yet here we are, parsing comments, weighing hypotheticals, watching members of Trump's own party quietly but firmly try to shut the door before it's kicked open. This is where Trump's worldview becomes critical. He doesn't process geopolitics as alliances or treaties or shared security obligations. He processes it like property, like leverage, like a deal that can be forced if you push hard enough. That mindset might work in a boardroom, but in global politics, it gets people killed. Republican senators know this. They understand that once a president frames military action as an option, machinery starts moving whether Congress likes it or not, which is why the War Powers Act suddenly became the battlefield, not as abstract constitutional debate, but as an emergency brake. And when that brake was pulled, when Republicans joined Democrats to advance a resolution limiting the president's ability to act unilaterally, Trump didn't respond with negotiation. He responded with rage, profanity, and threats. Because that's what happens when someone who believes power is personal realizes it's actually conditional. The reported phone call to Senator Susan Collins wasn't just about one vote. It was about the shock of discovering that loyalty has limits, that even in his own party, there are lines that can't be crossed without resistance. For Trump, that resistance feels existential. His entire second-term strategy hinges on projecting strength, inevitability, and control. Nothing undermines that faster than members of your own party publicly telling you no, especially when the issue at stake is war, authority, and constitutional boundaries. This is where the narrative accelerates. Faced with pushback, Trump doesn't retreat. He reframes. He reaches for the language of emergency, declaring extraordinary measures not as policy tools but as political weapons. The declaration of a national emergency tied to Venezuelan oil assets fits perfectly into this pattern. It allows him to cast himself as the sole protector of national security while portraying dissenting lawmakers as obstacles, even though the underlying reality is far more complicated, involving long timelines, massive corporate interests, uncertain infrastructure, and benefits that would flow primarily to multinational energy companies rather than ordinary Americans. But complexity has never been the point. The point is dominance, distraction, and control of the narrative. Emergencies change the rules. Emergencies centralize authority. Emergencies shift attention away from uncomfortable questions. And there are few questions more uncomfortable for this administration than why long-promised transparency efforts have stalled, why document releases have been delayed, why it took bipartisan pressure rather than executive initiative to move certain oversight actions forward. When lawmakers like Sheldon Whitehouse start talking openly about Inspector General compliance failures and unanswered timelines, it signals something important. Not a conclusion, not an accusation, but concern that process itself has broken down, and that concern is exactly what Trump cannot afford. His political survival depends not just on winning arguments, but on exhausting the public, flooding the zone, keeping every controversy competing for oxygen. That's why these threads aren't separate stories. Republican revolt, war powers, emergency declarations, stalled disclosures. They're the same story viewed from different angles. A presidency trying to outrun accountability by accelerating chaos. Republicans who once waved everything through are now calculating the cost of silence, weighing institutional damage against party loyalty, realizing that if they don't act now, they may not recognize the system later. Because once a president openly suggests he is guided only by his own judgment and not by law, treaties, or precedent, the question stops being partisan and becomes structural. That's the moment we're in. Behind closed doors, Republicans are asking themselves whether stopping Trump is an act of betrayal or an act of preservation, because history doesn't remember who tweeted the loudest. It remembers who stepped in when the rules were bending past their breaking point. And this revolt, quiet in some places, explosive in others, may be the first real sign that internal guardrails are finally being tested, not by the opposition, but by those who know exactly how dangerous unchecked power can become when it's wrapped in grievance, spectacle, and the language of permanent emergency. As this internal rebellion deepens, the real story shifts from what Trump is saying publicly to what Republicans are doing privately. Behind the cameras, behind the social media outrage, there is growing recognition among GOP lawmakers that they are no longer dealing with a conventional presidency, but with a leader who sees every institutional limit as a personal insult. And that realization is changing behavior in ways that would have been unthinkable a year ago. When the War Powers Resolution advanced with Republican votes, it wasn't an accident or momentary lapse in party discipline. It was a calculated move by senators who understand that once the executive branch normalizes unilateral military threats, especially toward allied territory, Congress becomes irrelevant unless it reasserts itself. That fear is constitutional. The War Powers Act exists precisely for moments like this, moments when a president's instincts outrun system safeguards, and the fact that Trump reacted with profanity, intimidation, and threats of political destruction only reinforces the concern that his decision-making is driven less by strategy and more by impulse, grievance, and legacy obsession. Legacy is critical here. Trump's fixation on being remembered, on being seen as dominant and historically consequential, has increasingly collided with the reality that his promises have not translated into stability, prosperity, or restraint. When the myth of no new wars collapses under the weight of military rhetoric, even loyal supporters begin to fracture. Wars are not abstractions to voters. They are costs, risks, consequences. Republicans up for re-election understand that no amount of branding can sell a conflict with allies as victory, which is why Trump's turn toward emergency powers feels less like leadership and more like panic. Emergencies allow him to bypass debate, marginalize dissent, and recast opposition as sabotage. This tactic has a long history where leaders who feel their authority slipping reach for extraordinary measures to freeze the political moment in their favor. The Venezuelan oil emergency is a textbook example of how economic assets are framed as security imperatives, even when practical benefits are distant, uncertain, and largely corporate. The language of emergency is not about timelines or feasibility. It's about optics, control, and narrative dominance. While the administration insists this move protects American interests, lawmakers on both sides see something else, a strategic distraction designed to shift attention away from congressional oversight, internal party dissent, and growing scrutiny of executive follow-through. This is where Trump's relationship with his own party becomes increasingly adversarial. He doesn't just want support, he demands submission. When senators assert independence, he treats it as betrayal rather than governance, publicly threatening their careers while privately depending on their votes for judicial confirmations and legislative priorities. That contradiction exposes the fragility of his position. Power that relies on fear rather than coalition eventually turns inward. We're watching that process unfold as Republican senators quietly coordinate, compare notes, and decide when and how to draw lines once unthinkable to draw. This internal calculation is fueled by broader concern that Trump's rhetoric about law, morality, and authority is no longer symbolic but operational. When a president suggests he is governed by personal judgment rather than international law or constitutional constraint, it signals a worldview in which rules exist only when convenient. That worldview terrifies lawmakers who understand that precedent outlives presidencies. If these norms collapse now, they won't magically reappear later. This anxiety has turned routine votes into flashpoints, phone calls into confrontations, and policy disagreements into existential tests of institutional survival. All of this is happening against mounting public confusion and fatigue where voters struggle to separate spectacle from substance. That confusion is not accidental, it's strategic. A crowded information environment benefits those who thrive on chaos. Trump has always understood that if everything is breaking news, nothing is accountability, which is why the convergence of these stories matters. The war powers fight, the emergency declaration, the Republican revolt, the stalled disclosures. They are interconnected stress fractures in a system being pushed beyond its design. Republicans who once rationalized every action as temporary or tactical are now confronting the possibility that silence is no longer neutral, that inaction itself becomes consent. That realization has changed the tone inside the party from loyalty to triage. They are no longer asking how to help Trump win the next news cycle. They are asking how to prevent irreversible damage to institutions they still need to function after he is gone. That shift, subtle but profound, is why this revolt feels different, quieter in some ways, but far more serious, because it's driven not by ideology but by alarm. By lawmakers who understand that when emergency powers become routine and war rhetoric becomes casual, the line between governance and authoritarianism blurs, and once that line disappears, it rarely comes back without cost. While the public argument rages over war powers and emergency declarations, a quieter, more unsettling pressure is building. Every time the administration escalates the language of crisis, it inadvertently shines light on what it seems most eager to outrun: oversight, documentation, timelines, the slow, methodical work of accountability. When lawmakers begin asking why promised disclosures are delayed, why reviews stretch on indefinitely, why statutory deadlines slip without explanation, they aren't alleging conclusions. They're identifying red flags. Red flags are dangerous not because they prove wrongdoing, but because they invite scrutiny. And scrutiny is the one thing a presidency built on speed, spectacle, and dominance struggles to manage. The discussion around delayed document releases has become sensitive because the administration itself elevated these disclosures into a defining promise, signaling urgency, prioritization, transparency, only for reality to unfold far more slowly than rhetoric suggested. When senators like Sheldon Whitehouse begin publicly describing the gap between expectation and execution, emphasizing numbers, timelines, compliance requirements rather than theories, it reframes the issue entirely, turning it from political talking point into administrative credibility test. That shift matters because credibility is the currency of governance. Once it's questioned, every subsequent explanation faces higher skepticism. The request for Inspector General review isn't an accusation. It's an admission that something in the process went wrong, whether through mismanagement, delay, or conflicting priorities. For an administration already battling internal revolt, that kind of inquiry compounds pressure because inspectors general operate outside political theater, dealing in memos, records, chains of decision-making. Their work doesn't disappear with a tweet or rally. This is where Trump's strategy becomes clearer, not in any single statement but in the pattern of escalation. Whenever scrutiny tightens, the narrative widens. Emergencies are declared. External threats are emphasized. The conversation shifts from documentation to dominance, from compliance to confrontation. It's not subtle, it's instinctive, a reflex honed over decades. Flood the zone, change the subject, raise the stakes, hope the audience moves on. But Congress isn't an audience, it's a co-equal branch. Some lawmakers are beginning to behave like it again, pressing for subpoenas, following financial trails, asking why certain avenues weren't pursued proactively if transparency was truly the priority. This isn't about proving an outcome, it's about explaining a process. Processes don't have feelings, they have records, and records are stubborn. They don't care how loudly anyone insists on their own version of events. The deeper this inquiry goes, the more it threatens to collide with Trump's preferred mode of operation, personal control over narrative, rather than institutional disclosure. That collision is what he fears, because it limits his ability to redefine reality on demand. This fear explains why rhetoric around loyalty has intensified, why dissent is framed as sabotage, why even bipartisan oversight is portrayed as partisan warfare. Because once you accept neutral review, you accept the possibility of outcomes you can't control. Trump has always treated control as synonymous with survival. This brings us back to why Republicans themselves are so uneasy. They can see the convergence forming, war powers being challenged, emergency powers being scrutinized. disclosure processes being questioned, internal party unity fraying, all at once. They understand this isn't just a bad news cycle, it's a systems test, one that asks whether institutions still function when pressure comes from the top, rather than the outside. Some Republicans are quietly acknowledging the real risk isn't what investigators might find, but what happens if oversight fails entirely. A system that can't examine itself becomes brittle, and brittle systems don't bend, they shatter. This awareness has shifted internal conversation from defense to distance, from justification to insulation, as lawmakers calculate how to separate their own constitutional responsibilities from a presidency that increasingly treats those responsibilities as obstacles. All the while, Trump continues pushing forward, framing himself as besieged, misunderstood, unfairly constrained, leaning harder into language of destiny and personal judgment, even as institutional machinery around him begins to hum louder, slower, more deliberately, because oversight doesn't rush, it accumulates, and that accumulation is what keeps him awake. No matter how many crises are declared or enemies named, paper trails don't vanish, deadlines don't forget, processes don't care about loyalty. That's why this moment feels heavier than previous controversies. It's no longer about what Trump says or tweets. It's about what he can't fully control. For a leader whose authority has always flowed from dominating the narrative, the quiet persistence of oversight may be the most destabilizing force he's faced yet. This is where the story ultimately lands, not in a single vote or phone call or emergency declaration, but in a reckoning Republicans, Democrats, and the public can no longer postpone. What we are watching is not just a clash of personalities or cycle of outrage, it's a stress test of whether American governance still functions when pressure comes from inside the highest office, rather than from outside threats. The reason this moment feels different is that resistance is no longer purely partisan, it's institutional, procedural, driven by lawmakers who may disagree on ideology, but increasingly agree on one uncomfortable truth. That power justified only by personal will, insulated by emergency language, defended through intimidation, eventually turns against the very system that grants it legitimacy. Republicans know this even if they won't all say it out loud. They understand today's shortcuts become tomorrow's precedents. Once those precedents exist, they don't belong to one man or one party. They belong to whoever comes next. That realization has transformed quiet unease into cautious action. Votes cast not for applause but for restraint. Oversight requests framed not as attacks but as necessities. Distance created not out of disloyalty but self-preservation. Because history is unforgiving to those who confuse silence with neutrality. Trump senses this shift, which is why his rhetoric has grown sharper, his framing more apocalyptic, his reliance on emergency powers more pronounced. Leaders who feel control slipping don't slow down. They accelerate. They raise stakes. They demand loyalty tests. They insist only they can protect the nation from collapse even as their own actions create the instability they warn against. That paradox is at the center of this presidency's final act. A leader obsessed with legacy but increasingly boxed in by process. A party torn between short-term alignment and long-term survival. And institutions forced to choose whether they will be performative or functional when it matters most. The real question isn't whether Trump wins the next argument or dominates the next news cycle. It's whether the rules that govern power are still stronger than the people who temporarily hold it. That question doesn't belong to politicians alone. It belongs to voters, citizens, anyone who expects stability rather than spectacle from leadership. As this revolt continues, as oversight grinds forward, as emergency narratives collide with constitutional limits, the outcome will tell us something profound about where American democracy actually stands. Not in theory, in practice. Systems don't fail all at once. They erode gradually, challenged, tested, normalized until someone finally says no. Right now, that no is coming from within, from Republicans who understand that stopping a leader from going too far is not betrayal, it's responsibility. Whether that responsibility holds under pressure will shape not just this presidency but the rules every future president inherits, which is why this moment matters, why it deserves attention beyond outrage, why it demands engagement, scrutiny, conversation. Because democracy doesn't protect itself, it relies on people willing to defend it when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, politically risky. That defense, quiet or loud, is the real story unfolding behind headlines, one that will be written not by declarations or threats but by choices made when power meets its limits. The world is watching to see whether those limits still mean anything.